think that's worked. Let's see if it does. Morning, guys. Hope we're all doing well and hope everyone's thoroughly enjoying this lovely no man's land between Christmas and New Year, where if you're anything like me, you might have forgotten what day of the week it is, which way is up, what a calorie is, and indeed how you're going to get yourself back into a meaningful routine in the new year. If you feel that way, trust me, I am in the same boat and I find myself in the same boat every year. Funnily enough, speaking of which, I'm actually on a boat right now. I've got a few hours to kill as I currently coast somewhere over the Irish Sea on my way back to the home country for some New Year's festivities. And so I thought, let me use this time to kick off a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a little while now, because it relates to two areas in which I have obviously significant personal experience. Maybe it's not obvious, but also a degree of professional experience as well. Now, this is an area that I can go into huge detail on, and so this may be the first in a series of videos potentially. But what I'm going to be discussing today, or at least starting off, is a conversation about ADHD and fitness, training, exercise, and movement. There's so much I can go into, so I thought for a starting point, let me use today to share probably 3 or 4 major ideas, concepts, and themes. What I'll start with is a little bit about why I think exercise training, movement, and fitness in general is so important, particularly for those with ADHD, both from a physical health and a mental health standpoint. I'll then share why, in my personal opinion and experience, forgive me, with myself and with my clients, why I think ADHD, maybe contrary to some presumptions, is actually a real superpower when it comes to fitness and when it comes to consistency, performance, and ultimately results. And then maybe a couple of risk factors for ADHD that make that more difficult, and how I myself have managed to mitigate some of those and have helped my clients do the same. I'll then share, maybe as the final point for today, a few slightly more actionable tips, tricks, and concepts that I'm really hoping in sharing might help some people with their planning for next year, as many are, and how you're going to approach and implement, maybe change or adjust your training, exercise, fitness, and movement routines, plans, and regimes into the new year. So hopefully, guys, that'll all be helpful. Do let us know, maybe on listening, if there are any areas you'd like me to deep dive into going forward. But for now, let's start at a fairly high level, and we can always drill down later over time. So, as a bit of background, maybe just before jumping off properly, I've shared this in a couple of videos already, but for me, number one, fitness is a very important part of my life and has been for pretty much my entire life, whether it was playing sport to a relatively high level through school and university, ultimately then maintaining my own more health, strength, and fitness related training routine for the last about 12 years since or so. And actually, it was something that I did professionally for a number of years as well. Back in my early 20s, I was a personal trainer, a strength and athletic performance coach primarily. I, over those 5 years, probably delivered something like just over 8,000 training sessions to probably around 200 different clients or so in different times. And so that for me, number one, was a fantastic experience in building my understanding of fitness and training, not just for myself, but then applied to a whole range of clients, from professional athletes to pensioners. But it also helped me to really understand and observe that although fitness, movement, and training, I think, is something that should be unique to everyone, based on goals, based on preferences, based on capabilities, based on time availability, there are actually, more than you would think, many common principles, ideas, and effects that I saw in my clients and helped my clients to achieve regardless of any of those variables. What I saw with those who were training in whatever modality they chose, whether it was running or lifting or Pilatesing or yogaing or walking, whatever it might have been, profound improvements, not just in their performance in that given domain in the gym, but outside of the gym as well, both physically, mentally, and in terms of overall performance. well-being, and I would say quality of life as well. Those who got stronger in the gym got stronger in life, whether that meant performing better at their sport or being more able to run around and play with their kids. Those who had the mental fortitude and built the mental fortitude to commit hard to difficult training and to do so consistently found themselves applying that same strength of resolve and mental muscle memory, if you like, to work and to their own individual personal pursuits as well. And the overall growth in confidence and self-efficacy and their self-belief in their capacity to do difficult things generally had really profound impacts on self-esteem and how they looked at the world and how they approached the 23 hours a day that they weren't spending moving and training. So these are all ideas that I'll flesh out, I think, in the context of this video over time. But that is a bit of background is why this is an area that I'm very, very passionate about and am personally still extremely interested in as well. So with that in mind, guys, let's jump into part one, why I think fitness training and movement is so important, and particularly for those with ADHD, given some of the particular proclivities and risk factors that we have, or rather the ADHD mind has. So let me start, I suppose, with the basics. So why is fitness so important? Well, to start really, really basic, it's very, very well documented that fitness training and some sort of consistent exercise and movement routine has profound benefits to both physical and mental health. We know that in terms of physical health, there is, for example, particularly with cardiovascular, but really any training, a reduction in heart rate, in blood pressure, and an increase in things like heart rate variability, for example, your ability to modulate heart rate, breathing rate, and overall stimulation based on the demands of your environment. The reduction in heart rate and blood pressure, the increase in heart rate variability, and things like VO2 max is very, very well documented to universally improve lifespan and improve health span as well, which is a concept I'll get into in a couple of seconds. We also know that particularly with resistance training, which in my view is probably objectively the most important training that you can do over your life, we know that the increase or maintenance of muscle mass, particularly as we get older over time, improves not only our physical capabilities to move well and to avoid injury, avoid falls, avoid physical damage later in life. There's also a profound impact on things like metabolism, your body's ability to use calories for energy and to modulate things like sugar consumption. And then finally, I think on the physical side, and this somewhat relates, you generally see with those who are physically active, particularly doing a combination and maybe the right balance of resistance-based training, flexibility-based training, and cardiovascular-based training, an overall decrease in the rates of chronic pain and of injury as well. So I know, guys, this is probably teaching a lot of you to suck eggs, but it's worth bearing in mind that regardless of your ADHD status, severity, or otherwise, there are significant and very, very well proven out physical benefits to some level of consistent exercise and training. If we're talking in kind of rough rules of thumb, the recommendations tend to be to getting somewhere between 90 and 180 minutes a week of what we would call, I suppose, cardiovascular-based training, where you are elevating your heart rate to at or just beyond a conversational level. When it comes to strength and resistance training, trying to ensure that your physical muscles are loaded with resistance at least once a week in a way that's challenging. And then similar for flexibility and mobility on a slightly more frequent basis. We know that just this basic prescription has really profound impact on improving health outcomes for the whole population. And people like Dr. Peter Attia speak very, very eloquently on this subject and the role of training for physical health. Now, what I think is more interesting to consider is how important those three things are, particularly for ADHD. And so if I look at, say, If I look at the first line, for example, heart rate, blood pressure, and HRV, well, we know that ADHD brings with it a couple of different things. Number one, it tends to bring with it a decreased ability to regulate emotions, yes, but more the physiological responses that we have to them, your level of stimulation based on the demands of the environment. A reduction in heart rate, in blood pressure, and an increase in heart rate variability actually relates to the ADHD mind in an improvement to regulate our physiology, to manage feelings like being too highly stimulated or too lowly stimulated, to manage some of the comorbid impacts of things like anxiety, for example, which we'll get into in a couple of seconds. We also know, maybe related to the other 2 points around muscle mass, the improvement in health span and the reduction of pain and injury, that over a lifetime, people like Russell Barkley speak well on this. We all know the short-term impacts of ADHD if we have it in terms of our day-to-day maybe difficulty in focusing or in emotional regulation, but it's well documented now that ADHD sufferers tend to suffer worse long-term health outcomes as well, perhaps owing, for example, to the greater likelihood of indulging in improper nutrition practices or not, for example, sticking to proper exercise routines. And so overall, if you are looking through these three lenses at the benefits of exercise for physical health, for ADHD, these things actually become massively important in fighting the good fight against the things that would otherwise damage some of these variables or put us at greater risk as well. So that's the physical side. And then on the mental side, guys, again, speaking about the whole population, well, we know that exercise really across the board does a few things for us. It improves sleep and what we would call circadian rhythm, that daily rhythm of hormones, neurotransmitters, and energy that naturally get us waking up at the right times, going to sleep at the right times, and managing our energy throughout the day. We know on the other side that physical exercise also brings with it across the population a significant reduction in anxiety and depression and depressive-like symptoms. So here, there's a number of different reasons for it. Some of them relate purely to themes like self-efficacy and confidence. Others relate to some of the physical impacts that exercise has in terms of our ability to live well and to live healthily. But certainly across the population and across the literature, exercise has a very, very direct impact on some of these comorbid challenges. And then finally, guys, around the mental side of things, and this is where we'll get into a slightly different theme, but self-efficacy and confidence is actually a both subjective common experience, but also a well-documented medical result of exercise as well. Those who are able to move more effectively and confidently, especially into older age as a result of, for example, increased muscle mass and reduced pain and reduced injury rates, tend to favor themselves more strongly when looking at unknown circumstances. That itself is an improvement in confidence. Moreover, those who are training effectively and can see progress over time in that regard, they have a clear blueprint as to how they can succeed at least to a degree, difficult things. This improves self-efficacy, and both of these things improve self-image, which is a major cornerstone of mental health. People like Dr. Paul Conti, for example, in talking about concepts like agency, gratitude, and generative drive, these things both come from and reinforce strong self-efficacy, self-image, and self-esteem as a major cornerstone of mental health. And so when we look at these three through the lens of ADHD, well, we know, for example, that ADHD is very commonly comorbid with sleep problems, whether that's in terms of timing, duration, or quality, both short-term and over time. We also know that ADHD is highly comorbid with anxiety and depression. I think many, probably most, report instances of anxiety in the short term, but depression in the long term, depending on the literature you're reading, impacts somewhere between 30 and 70% of people who suffer with ADHD over their course of their lifetime. And for me personally, based on experience and based on what I've seen of others, I would say it's probably on the higher end. And then for the third concept, this is actually one that I'm going to jump into a bit more detail on because I think it's really important. So ADHD, one of the common challenges or common risks of ADHD is a reduction in the sense or strength of self. This can express itself as low self-esteem. It can express itself as low confidence. And it can certainly express itself as things like a lack of agency and independence. Now, it's outside of the scope of this video, certainly, to go into where some of these come from and why they are the case. Self-esteem, for example, can relate to things like RSD. Confidence can relate to things like your ability to stick with it and achieve long-term goals. And then agency can relate to issues like what can be affectionately referred to as people-pleasing. And what's the best way to express this one? Living vicariously or to others' standards. So, knowing that all of these things are risk factors when it comes to the sense of self, particularly by ADHD, this is why I think training is such an important thing for those with ADHD. When you train, and this isn't just about getting results, guys, but it's about being the version of you that got to the gym, that pushed through that difficult exercise session or that boring activity, that version of you that did so for a day, and then for 3 days, and then for a week, and then for 3 weeks and onwards. The version of yourself that sees those improvements over time. They all enable us with the ADHD mind to say, I can do hard things. They allow us to say to ourselves, I can succeed. And they allow us to say things like, I did this for me. And as an extension of that, I did this for my future. Being able to say all of these things expressed through the lens of getting stronger, getting fitter, or even just, I got to the gym, is a very, very powerful antidote to the risks to the sense of self that ADHD brings with it. I'm taking my time on this point and I'm pausing on it because for me, when I look back and I ask myself why, in spite of the chaos of the rest of my life through my 20s and 30s, was fitness the one thing I kept coming back to? Because it was something that always allowed me to, in a short or long-term way, be the expression of what for me personally was my best sense of self. To have something that was mine and mine alone, and that was a true act of deep and meaningful self-love. So when it comes to physical and mental health, training improves objectively physical health markers that are strong indicators for quality of life and duration of life. They impact similar markers for mental health related to sleep and circadian rhythm, the reduction in anxiety and depression, and then for me, the big one, improvements in self-efficacy, confidence, and self-image, which I think for me is super, super important to consider. And then finally, guys, the last thing I want to relate here is something more of a physical benefit here. But there is a strong psychological component to it as well. I mentioned the sense of self a couple of times here, and I've referred to it more as the sort of psychological image of self. But here, I'm going to talk more about the physical sense of self. So With, let's move that there. With ADHD, there's a concept that often gets interrupted called interoception, your ability to perceive your internal environment. So let's say on the left here, you've got internal and you've got external. Your internal environment, the things that you can feel going on in your body in different conditions through eyesight, through hearing, but more through real physical feeling of things like your heart rate, your breathing rate, your posture, your level of tension, level of strain. It's something that's important for humans to be in touch with because those feelings are instructive and they often relate to how we actually experience emotions in particular. If you have strong interoception and this internal self is saying, right, my heart rate has increased, my muscle tension has increased, and I've got that feeling in the pit of my stomach that not everything is good right now. Healthy interoception allows you to internalize that and say, I'm scared of X, Y, Z. I'm real, it doesn't say scared, that'll do. However, if your ADHD mind, as is commonly the case, interrupts your ability to interocept or to otherwise understand and acknowledge what these different signals mean, well, the risk is that you feel these feelings of your heart rate going up, of tension in the body, of that gut feeling, but you have no idea what it's telling you. You don't know the problem, and thus you can't fix the problem, whatever that might be, internally or environmentally. Partly because when you engage in physical exercise and movement, you experience changes at the levels of heart rate, of blood pressure, of your heart rate increasing and decreasing, and of muscles contracting and moving, of joints feeling good or bad. You actually start to gain some very, very strong internal signals, which you then learn through the mode of exercise to control, modulate, and kind of manage that cause and effect relationship. And so to say all of this, the last reason that I think it's so important for those with ADHD to move is it improves interoception. This improves, among other things, emotional regulation. It improves, among other things, your ability to solve the right problems, particularly if you're not feeling great, but also to do reliably what feels good. Now, if we know what reliably we can do to feel good, particularly if that involves movement and exercise, we then have a really useful tool at our disposal to effectively do what the mind cannot do. Because, and I forget where this was quoted, but it's something that I have lived by ever since I heard it. The mind cannot control itself. The body can. By engaging in exercise and movement and improving your capabilities around your interoception, learning to modulate this cause and effect relationship between actions, environment, and feelings, you gain a tool to, improve interoception, to improve emotional regulation, to solve the right problems, and to do what feels good. You gain the ability where the mind cannot control the mind, particularly in states of negative emotion and high anxiety, to use the body instead to do so. So I'll take a pause for a second there, but to just be really clear about this. Exercise improves physical and mental health. It improves sense of self, esteem, image, and well-being, and it also improves for everyone the ability to interocept and to interpret your emotions. But when we consider the deficit that those with ADHD start with, both short term and over time, in physical and mental health markers, in self-esteem, self-image, and self-efficacy, and in their ability to interocept and thus control internal signals. This is why, for me, if you have ADHD and you are looking at treating the negative symptoms thereof over time, absolutely look at, consider, continue with, if you are, medications like I do. Do stick with things that work for you, like psychotherapy, like meditation, like mindfulness practices. But if you haven't already, do consider what exercise training and movement can do for you in that regard as well. Now, the good news is, if you have ADHD, I actually believe you have a superpower for consistency and results. And the good thing is, when it comes to getting results from your training, whatever those goals are, consistency is the biggest and most important variable. There is no truly optimal training routine, combination of exercises, timings, plans, volumes, frequencies, intensities, or otherwise. There's nothing truly optimal. You could change any of those variables in isolation, but the biggest determinant of training success over time, and I've seen this play out in hundreds of clients, and indeed so has the rest of the world in the rest of the world, consistency is the most important thing. And I actually believe that ADHD can drive both of these things disproportionately when it comes to exercise and training. And there's a few reasons for that, right? When we think about, say, gym environments, or if you're outdoors and running, these are generally dopaminergic environments. They are stimulating, they are rewarding, and overall, they're a fun place to be for the ADHD mind. They are a place where there is enough variety and novelty, but with just enough predictability and routine. And what you actually do in the gym is also in itself is dopaminergic as well. If we look at ADHD through a very simplified lens, as the desperate hunt for dopamine, as it's often been called, well, exercise, movement training, and being in gym environments is one of those reliable places where you can go to that is healthy and sustainable to build and gain those dopamine rewards, those gold coins that we're all searching for. And what's good is, it is a longer term, longer releasing, less spiky and less impulsive kind of dopamine hit than something like an addictive substance, a video game, another Instagram post or YouTube video. And so if you can marry the desperate hunt for dopamine with the dopaminergic environment and activity that comes with exercise and fitness, and find what works for you, consistency and dedication and all those things that the neurotypical brain find quite difficult with training, I've always been surprised for myself and others. It's actually made significantly easier, in my view, with ADHD. I also think that pattern recognition helps when it comes to the ADHD mind. We know that, generally speaking, the ADHD mind is more lateral in its thinking. It's more pattern-based as a whole. And when we look at exercise training and movement, well, actually, all exercise, pretty much anyway, is pattern-based as well. If you have an ADHD mind and you can learn the basic fundamentals of exercise training and movement, if you can learn basically to push, to pull, to lunge, or even to squat, to hinge, to carry, and really, we call it gait, but to walk or run, and you get proficient really, these transfer to everything. And the chances are that if you have ADHD, your skill uptake in different, say, resistance training movements, different sports, different things like yoga, Pilates, whatever it might be, for example, will actually be a lot quicker than it would be if you didn't have an ADHD mind, because your ability to take these basic fundamentals and apply them to different movements and different capacities and domains is actually going to be greatly improved. Once you've learnt how to do let's say, a down-facing dog or a downward dog, I suppose you would call it in yoga, well, then you've probably learned a lot of what you need to in order to do a push-up or to do a bench press or to do a cable push or to really push anything. Once you've learnt, maybe in a sport like cricket or rounders, to throw a ball, well, you've probably started building, without realizing, the same movement pattern of throwing that you can then apply to just about any other implement, including throwing a punch as well. Your ability, based on these fundamentals, to pick up new sports, to vary your training to keep it interesting, and ultimately to push harder, having learnt those skills, be greatly improved by ADHD. And this is a big reason I think actually it's a major superpower, that pattern-based thinking, that pattern recognition that allows the transferability of skill over time. And then the final reason, guys, that I think ADHD is so useful for training is because actually you can make the hard things easier. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, you have a different gear. You have a different perspective. And damn it, you probably care more. So, why do I say that the ADHD mind, when it comes to training, has a different gear? The emotional experience of the ADHD mind, particularly one that's driven so much by dopamine and those feel-good neurotransmitters, is such that, and I think we can all relate to this, particularly with the ADHD mind, if you're in the zone and you're committed and you're focused to something, if you're stimulated, if you're in a high arousal state, your ability to get shit done eclipses just about any neurotypical version of you and what it could have done when you're on. When we look at training, there are, maybe I'll write this down here. When we look at training over, say, 5, maybe 6 weeks, what you tend to find is that, and we call this intensity up here, what we tend to find is that there is a kind of natural cycle of increasing and then decreasing intensity over time. And what you tend to find is that when you hit these peaks in terms of intensity, that's when you hit PBs, you make big strides in progress, or maybe you do your competitions. Say every 2 weeks, for example, as a beginner trainee, you might aim to have 1 to 2 sessions in week 1 of a relatively easy and manageable load, and you might try and overreach and progress your exercises on the 3rd session. As you get a bit more mature in your training, maybe every 3 to 4 weeks, you're having those hard sessions. And what the ADHD mind really does is it gives you that second gear so that for those big efforts, those big training sessions where you're going for the bench press personal best, or you're trying to nail your 5K, or you're just trying to go from 6 to 10 minutes of slow walking on the treadmill, whatever that means to you, your ability to tap into that high arousal, focused, committed state and push through difficult things when it really matters will help you get so much more out of these peaks. It will make the peaks higher, which will then over time contribute to greater and greater training success and greater enjoyment and fulfillment from those sessions as well. And so for me, to wrap up this section, ADHD is massively important, and I think is a massive superpower actually for training. We are able, in my view, to drive better consistency and thus better results over time based on finding that version of training, exercise, and movement that becomes a reliable dopamine source for us because of the environment, because of the activity, because of the balance between novelty and repeatability that training brings with it. Number two, through pattern recognition, the ability for those with ADHD to pick up a new exercise, activity, or training modality and get really good really quickly, and to transfer those skills from one to another, mean that your enjoyment, your success in these endeavors is going to be much higher, and indeed your ability to enjoy your training and fitness by varying it over time is greatly improved, in my view, by the ADHD mind. And then finally, having that extra gear, that real high dopamine, high drive, high arousal state to push through the real difficult sessions and really overreach when you want to and when you need to, will not only improve your results short term, your enjoyment short term, but if done in a sensible way, will contribute to better long-term results as well. Now, it's not all good, of course, because there are naturally some risk factors, and I'm sure many will be listening with ADHD who have maybe struggled with their own training journeys and perhaps wondered why. And the truth is, that's because there are some significant maybe drawbacks to ADHD that need to be managed. So one for me is there needs to be a degree of modularity in training. I talked about this on my first video about routines, but if your routine is too structured, if it's too demanding, or just too samey, it probably will be boring, stressful, and restrictive. And as we know with the ADHD mind, if anything is any combination of these two things, then enjoyment and consistency will drop like a stone. So to mitigate that, be modular, have variety where you can, and at least in my view, I think you should vary intensity over time as well. By making it modular, it's not about set days, it's about sessions per week. For example, I want that there we go. If it is something that perhaps you're struggling with because it's a bit too samey, a bit too boring, add variety. I'd recommend here, pick maybe one, maybe two or three different exercise modalities that you like. Pick one that you enjoy intrinsically. Find a sport, find a class that isn't about the best and most optimal way of training for health, performance, or whatever, but it's just something you enjoy that involves movement. I would then pick something that makes you work hard, but is simple. So this, for me, might not be the most enjoyable part of your training, but it would be something that is simple and repeatable that you can apply just raw effort to, and you can feel and see objectively the results of that effort over time. That might be running, it might be cycling, it might be lifting weights in some basic push, pull, squatting, pressing, rowing style movements, for example. Or it might be something like a yoga or a Pilates, where you can feel the challenge and the difficulty in holding and maintaining a position or a stretch, but you can push through that difficulty and thus improve over time. Find something that satisfies that need for effort And then probably the final one that I would encourage anyone to consider here is pick something which is, there we go, which is complex. Pick something that is actually mentally challenging, requires technique and requires positioning and requires thought in your approach, rather than just physical effort. If I look at these maybe three lenses myself, the way that I've chosen to implement that into my training for the last particularly 3 or 4 years or so, I have a kind of activity that I personally, for me, just really enjoy. I don't think that it is the most optimal way for me to train for strength or for fitness or for muscle mass or for flexibility or anything. But I really enjoy kettlebell work, for example. I like swings and cleans and presses and snatches and tricks and all sorts like that. It's good exercise, it's movement, but it's fun and it's engaging, and I don't feel under massive stress or pressure to perform in any particular way in doing it, but just to do it. On the bottom rung, I have a couple of things that for me are maybe not the most fun thing in the world, but allow me to apply a lot of hard effort. I do, but I'm not a massive natural fan of long distance running. But as a simple modality which allows me to apply effort and apply focus to a simple movement, running is the one for me. And then on the kind of complex side, outside of my kind of normal strength-based training, I've made a deliberate effort in the last couple of years, especially to try different sports and to use my body in different ways. And the version, at least for me, for the last few months has been the winner. There has been indoor rock climbing, has been bouldering. Not only is it physically challenging, but it's one of those lovely sports and activities where it's not the strongest person that necessarily wins, that does the V4, the V5, the V6, the V7, and reaches the top of the wall. It's the person who has mastered the technique and the mechanics and has practiced the right kind of exercise and movement in order to achieve that. And it's a thinking game as much as a physical one. So for me, that three-part structure creates enough variety and trains in different domains that I always feel as if I can progress on at least one of those three. And I suppose to a greater degree, it keeps me interested and fresh in my mental attitude towards training, which over time produces better consistency, which over time produces, as we know, significantly better results. And so with that, guys, let me then share maybe a couple of other tips and tricks before I close this one off. So I've talked already about how I would think about structuring training from a variety standpoint. Have something you enjoy, something complex, and something that is simple but difficult, simple but hard in terms of the effort you apply. I've used a couple of words here, but if I can really sum up how you think about your training, certainly maybe going into this next phase of the end of your year into next year. Number one, make it a micro routine for the reasons I mentioned above. Make it modular and make it varied enough. Number two, don't try to optimize. If you have maybe a very specific training goal that requires an incredibly high level of performance in a narrow domain, that is the time to focus on the specific activities that will get you the marginal gains to go from second place to first place. And there are people and situations and times where that's absolutely appropriate. But as a starting point, whether you form the majority of the population or indeed that specific part of the population, but probably for the majority of your time, focus on enjoyment first. That will drive consistency. That will drive progress. And sure enough, that will drive further enjoyment. Do not concern yourself, and this is speaking now as a personal trainer and not someone with ADHD, with the minutiae, if you're a bodybuilder, for example, as to which specific angle, frequency, rep range, set range, hand positioning, or alignment of the sun, moon, and stars that will produce the best peak contraction of your bicep muscle, thinking that that's going to make an iota of difference to your results for the vast majority of people. As Mike Mentzer put it, get a 20-inch arm first. What that really describes is focus on the fundamentals. Consistency with progressive overload over time. Basic movements or capacities. And as part of that, narrow down to what matters to you. If you plan to optimize your training based on the objective standards set by whatever sports scientist, influencer, researcher, celebrity, or otherwise, you will almost inevitably be forcing yourself to do types of training and specific exercises or classes or programs that you don't really enjoy. And as we know, if you don't enjoy it, you won't be consistent. If you're not consistent, you won't progress and you won't enjoy that either. Variety is good in training, at least to a degree, but spend some time, if you haven't already, to find the version of exercise, training, movement, and fitness that works for you. For me, that was always focused around two main domains, being as strong as I could, expressed in terms of picking up heavy things and putting them down again, whilst at the same time being able to run long distances, being able to, even slowly, cover 10Ks, half marathons, 20 milers with relative ease, relative regularity, and relative comfort. Those, for me, were two of the things that I've always based my training around, and especially for the last 5 or 6 years with running. And then the other side for me is also having at least one sport on the go that I feel like I'm improving at. Right now it's bouldering. Last year it was jiu-jitsu. Maybe later this year it'll be badminton. Who knows? But for me, that is me narrowing down to the things I really care about. I don't personally particularly find Pilates or yoga that much fun. Not enough to be consistent with it. I take inspiration from it, but that's not my thing, even if it might be optimal. In the inverse, if running is your thing, be a runner. If climbing is your thing, be a climber. If lifting is your thing, be a lifter. Feel free to dabble in the remainder, but don't feel like you have to in the interest of what's optimal. And then a little bit more tactically, guys, just to wrap this one up. Particularly if you're medicated, and this is a disclaimer as much as anything, be mindful of your heart rate, be mindful of your blood pressure, be mindful of your current fitness, don't do too much too soon, and also be mindful of your physical capabilities as well. If particularly you have injuries, disabilities, or let's say prior health conditions, number one, be kind and accommodating to yourself. Work, I'm not going to say within those limitations, but if your starting point is someone who has had a history of injury or chronic pain, who is differently abled, or who has prior health conditions, mental, physical, or otherwise, just make that your starting point and work from that basis. Particularly in those circumstances, do consider consulting not only a doctor, medical professional, but also consider consulting a trainer or a coach or someone in your community that has expertise in that area. In my experience anyway, I mean, I was never a specialist personal trainer for any differently abled populations, for example, but I knew people who were. And so when I was asked for advice or to train individuals, maybe a different starting point, my first encouragement would be to refer them to those specialists who could help them much better than I could and much better than they could themselves to quickly get down to the kind of training on the kind of frequency that A, they could do, but B, that allowed them to find, as I've mentioned a few times now, the enjoyment that drove the consistency can't find it now, that drove the consistency, that ultimately drove the progress, that drove further enjoyment and a lifelong love of training, which I think is in everyone's interest. So to close this one off, guys, I know it's been a long one, and I know I've darted around a few different concepts there. These are all ones that we can go into more detail on and be a bit more prescriptive about in future videos for those who are interested. To close this one out, I just want to say number 1, number 2, and number 3 as takeaways. Number 1, as you look ahead and maybe consider your own training right now, particularly with the ADHD mind, what I would like to leave you with is this idea. Use training, exercise, and movement as an act of self-love. See it as something that you are doing for yourself that is yours to own and yours to benefit from. That you are investing not just in kind of, the physical results that you might want in a future version of you, but actually you're investing in making your day-to-day physical, mental life and quality of life better. And it is something that you can't buy and no one can buy from you. It is something that is yours and yours alone. And rather than, I think as can commonly be the case, considering training and exercise, particularly things like long cardio sessions and brutal weightlifting, an act of self-flagellation and self-punishment, do as best you can everything when it comes to training, exercise, and movement from a place of self-love. That's the first thing. The second thing is maybe linked to that. Use exercise, training, and movement to be more and not be less. It's very rare that I've seen anyone use exercise, movement, and training as a tool principally to, say, lose weight, for example, or to really kind of change the physical appearance of their body to be less bad in their own eyes, and succeed sometimes, but to actually have them gain health and happiness and enjoyment and everything from it, it's been very rare. Those, however, who look at training as a way of being more, of being able to do more, of being able to live more, of being able to play with their kids more, being able to go and see more sights and try more different activities and to go on more walks and to climb more mountains, or just to get around the house more effectively and cook nice dinners more. They're the ones that have succeeded, enjoyed, and ultimately had the results they really wanted, mentally, physically, and otherwise. So use training. I can encourage you to be more and not less. And then finally, guys, any questions, any ideas, hit me with them. I'm very, very happy to talk more about my own personal training, what I've done, what I do now, what's helped me, and how that all looks. I'm very happy to talk about ideas for specific circumstances within reason. And also very happy to talk about anything else, including and not limited to, should I discuss this more. You might tell me this isn't interesting, Gareth, but you know what, I'm hoping that's not the case. And if it is, well, give me a shout anyway. Always happy to hear your feedback, any questions you might have as well. So that all being said, guys, I'm probably about a couple of hours away now from the Irish coast, so I'm going to grab some shut-eye on that lovely divan behind me. But for now, guys, as always, look after yourselves and look after each other. Thank you all for listening over these last few weeks, last few months, and indeed today. And I will look forward to the next conversation.